Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in. The topic of my presentation is examining foreign policy agendas through countries' international broadcasting. And in particular, I will be talking about my study of RT and Russian foreign policy documents. This presentation will consist of two parts. First, I'm going to talk about international broadcasting and public diplomacy in Russia. Here I will talk about context, about how public diplomacy and information and communication in general are seen as a part of a foreign policy agenda in Russia. And then in a second part, I will talk about RT. I will explain what role RT plays in Russian public diplomacy, to what degree it is a tool of communicating foreign policy agenda, and finally, I will also talk about narratives and messages that don't match the official Russian foreign policy agenda and where they fit in RT content in general. Now, as a brief intro, I would like to give you some background details. First of all, RT is a Russian state-funded international TV channel. It's formerly known as Russia Today. I would like to draw your attention to the word state-funded, which does not equal state-owned, and RT is indeed not state-owned, which is a mistake people often make when talking about the channel. RT is an autonomous non-profit organization which is legally independent from the government. And when I looked at RT, I looked specifically at conflict coverage because, as we know in studying public diplomacy, when else is public diplomacy as important as during a country's involvement in a war? So I focused on the war in Ukraine and the war in Syria, and specifically on news coverage in Russian and in English, which I then studied through quantitative content analysis, textual analysis. And then in order to be able to speak about foreign policy agenda, I did a document analysis as well. It is of a selection of most relevant Russian foreign policy documents and President Putin's Federal Assembly speeches. So moving on to the international broadcasting and public diplomacy in Russia. This topic of information and communications is discussed in many Russian foreign policy documents. You will now be able to see the list of some of the documents that I studied that discuss this topic extensively, and most of them actually discuss it in similar wording. For example, the 2010 military doctrine says, in modern conflicts, information confrontation is used to achieve political goals without the use of military power and to form a positive reaction to the use of military power. And in the foreign policy concepts, both the 2013 and the 2016 version, they both argue that information has become an important factor of influence in the world politics alongside military power. At the same time, the 2013 foreign policy concept explains that the increase of global competition can lead to destructive and illegal use of soft power with the goals of pressuring sovereign states, interference in their internal affairs, destabilization of the situation in the country, manipulation of the public opinion and conscience. So being able to spread and control information is seen as important for the country, for Russia, and it's on the same level as having military power. And according to these documents, Russia is behind other countries in terms of being able to project its views to the world. And it's not being portrayed fairly by international media either. So the documents argue that Russia needs to get better at using information, such as media means, for example, in order to explain its positions and policies to the world and defend itself against what it perceives to be misinformation and propaganda. For example, the 2016 version of the Doctrine of Information Security connects being able to communicate with the world directly to national interest. And here's what it says. It says, delivering to the Russian and international audience reliable information on Russia's state policies and the country's position on the main world events is a matter of national interest. Therefore, we can see that RT, when it was founded in 2005, arrived in the world, in a country where it was seen as an essential tool of spreading information about Russia, and also as a defense mechanism, defense tool, maybe is a better word, against what Russia perceives to be misinformation and disinformation. And in fact, the way RT presents itself is actually very similar to how the documents I just mentioned describe Russia's information interest. First, the channel's description on their About Us page presents the idea about the need to communicate a Russian point of view. It says that RT acquaints international audiences with a Russian viewpoint on major global events. And then, connected to the idea of RT as a tool of defense against what Russia perceives to be untrue or harmful information, is this quote by the editor-in-chief of the channel, Margarita Simonyan. She was asked in an interview about the state budget spending on the channel and whether it's justified, and whether the channel is indeed useful to Russia, since most of the time it covers events that have nothing to do with the country. So, for example, when it covers local events in countries where it operates. And the editor-in-chief has said the following. She said, "It's important to have a channel that the audience gets used to, that the audience likes. And then when you need to, you show them what you need to show them. In a way, not having an international broadcasting operation is the same as not having a Ministry of Defense. When we're not at war, it doesn't seem that necessary. But when we are at war, it's critical. And you can't start an army a week before the war starts." In addition, Simonyan argues that everyone is doing it and that there are no international broadcasters who are doing anything other than promoting the values of the country from which they broadcast. But, she argues, good broadcasters are transparent about this, like RT is being transparent on their website, saying a Russian viewpoint on major global events. So, according to RT, good international broadcasters shouldn't try to present a balanced view, or shouldn't pretend like their reporting is based on the principle of objectivity, but rather they should be transparent about their political views and allegiances. And this is the context in which we should be understanding RT's work. Now I'll move on and talk about some of my findings in relation to RT coverage and foreign policy agenda. So what role does RT play in Russian public diplomacy? After looking at 1,523 articles quantitatively, 167 of them qualitatively, and as well as looking at 19 foreign policy documents, I can say that the majority of RT coverage delivers the messages that are strongly aligned with the Russian foreign policy agenda. This alignment can be detected on several levels. But for the time constraints, I will show you just one example. This example is in connection to how Ukraine and Ukrainian government are portrayed by, on one hand, the documents, and on the other hand, the RT coverage. So, Russian foreign policy documents make it very clear that they see the Euromaidan protest and the ensuing revolution and the new government in Ukraine as orchestrated by and controlled by the West. In his 2014 Federal Assembly address, also known as the Crimea speech, Putin says that our American friends are directly or indirectly influencing our relationship with our neighbors, and that the US and the EU supporting an unconstitutional coup in Ukraine negatively affects Russian national interests. Further, in the same speech, Putin actually directly refers to quote-unquote foreign sponsors of the Ukrainian government and explains that this situation in Ukraine actually reflects global events and global trends where the West uses interferences in other countries' affairs and sort of tries to decide the fates of the world. And these are some examples of RT coverage of the war in Ukraine. In this headline is a quote from Russia's former ambassador in the UN, Vitaly Churkin. He says, "Kyiv, pushed by their Western guides, has chosen a wrong path on every crossroad." Further, in the article, he actually specifies that by Western guides, he means the United States in particular. And he also calls them the Western sponsors/curators of today's government in Kyiv. The Russian word for guides that he uses, povadir, is actually really interesting. It carries the meaning of a seeing eye dog or an assistant that helps a blind person. In rare cases, it could also be used to refer to a local person who knows, for example, an area of wilderness really well and who guides around foreign people who aren't familiar with the area. So this way, the Ukrainian government is presented as a blind person who's being guided around by this seen eye dog of the West. And this is another example from the coverage of unrest in Ukraine during the Euromaidan protest, where a quote from counter-protesters in Odessa is presented to say that the anti-government protests in Kiev were paid for by the West. And this article, based on an interview with a German journalist, manages to speak about Ukraine and Crimea without actually speaking about Ukraine and Crimea. And it says that the US government is pitting Russia and the EU against each other. And this is a curious example because it shows that the EU is sometimes portrayed as a victim of manipulation, but the US is always the villain. This is another example, and as you can see, these views are always presented as quotes, so in a way we can't say that this is the RT point of view, because someone else said it, they just reported it. However, at the same time, in terms of journalistic balance, there are actually quotes from Ukrainian actors, but the thing is, they're almost always on a different topic. So while there is technical balance, both sides get to speak. This idea that the West is puppeteering Ukraine is never actually disputed anywhere in the text. And what I also found is that sometimes there are messages that don't actually match the official Russian foreign policy agenda. And what is curious about them is that they're not randomly spread out through the events that I looked at, but that they concentrate around two particular events, the downing of MH17 and the chemical attack in Han Shihun in Syria. So, for example, in the coverage of MH17, in the Russian language sample, I found 42 different narratives and angles of discussion of who's to blame for the shooting of the plane. And in the English language sample, I found 21 narratives. And here they are now scrolling through your screen, hopefully. So are they all Russian viewpoints on major global events? How do they fit into RT's role as a public diplomacy tool? I believe that in these cases of events that received global attention and had potential international consequences for Russia, RT actually stops being a public diplomacy tool in the strict sense of the word, and it starts to publish different partisan narratives, conspiracy theories that expand beyond the official Russian foreign policy agenda. However, there's always a however, we should note that these narratives do have a unifying thread in them. It's that Russia isn't guilty, and they are all implying that anyone can be blamed for this event. So, in situations where there are narratives and messages that do not match the official Russian foreign policy agenda, they still fit into it overall, pragmatically, by serving the overall Russian interest, by saying that Russia isn't guilty. Thus, I can conclude that as a public diplomacy tool, or a public diplomacy actor might be a better way to refer to RT. RT does present Russian viewpoint of global events, which, as the documents have shown, is very important for the Russian foreign policy, which considers information a matter of national interest and national security. And to be fair, this is also how RT described their mission on their own About Us page. But what is particularly interesting now is that in certain circumstances, RT also includes in their coverage messages that don't match the official Russian foreign policy agenda, but covers them in a way that serves Russian interests. Thank you so much for your attention. Please do ask questions. I'm really looking forward to your feedback.